Savannah is a city that lives with its dead. Stroll down the tree-shaded sidewalks, and in many cases, you're literally walking over the bodies of those who've gone before. The city's first cemetery once occupied the southwestern corner of what is today known as Wright Square. Within 17 years, that cemetery was full.
We do know that in the early days of the colonies, there were certainly a lot of deaths. In fact, the first death in the New Georgia colony was that of William Cox, and he was the doctor that came over.
In 1750, a new graveyard opened on the southeastern edge of town. Today, we call this 6-acre plot Colonial Park Cemetery.
But originally, this was Christ Church burial ground, Christ Church being the mother church of Georgia. It was open to all Christian people of whatever denomination.
For the next 103 years, Savannians opened the earth here to receive their dead, by the thousands. With no organized lots like we know today, the graves were scattered all around. There are roughly 600 marked burials here today, but recent archaeology has uncovered traces of at least 9,000 more hidden beneath the soil. Eventually, the once new cemetery was a horrifying place.
Space was limited, and after 10 years, they could reopen a grave and put in a new burial. So there were very likely human remains scattered around.
Eventually, the earth could receive no more remains. The cemetery was closed to new burials after 1853. Today, visitors enter Colonial Park through wide gates at the corner of Oglethorpe and Abercorn Streets. The first things that catch many visitors' attention are the many tall brick tombs, believed to be unique to Savannah and Charleston. 50 of them rise above the headstones in Colonial Park. Historian Preston Russell was allowed to open the seal and enter one of the 2-century-old structures in 1980.
Well, it was very imposing, and I learned those vaults over there are actually little houses about 2/3 beneath the ground. They're about 4 feet wide and 6 feet long, so multiple people can easily be inside one of those vaults.
The story of Savannah's early days is literally written on the walls of these odd little buildings. Take, for instance, the Habersham family vault. Inside are the remains of one of the city's most ardent British loyalists during the Revolutionary War, James Habersham, as well as those of 2 of his sons who took the opposite path and rose to prominence in the fight for American independence. Bitterly divided in life, they rest together now in death. But perhaps more interesting even than the crypts are the many beautiful symbols carved onto the cemetery's headstones. The most frequently appearing are trees.
The broken tree is someone whose life has been cut short. Depending on the height of the stump, you could tell whether it was a young person or an older person.
Other often used symbols include urns representing the ashes to which we all return, poppy flowers which symbolize the forgetfulness and sleep of death, and the hourglass for the end of a person's allotted time on earth. Soul portraits were another popular gravestone feature. Bearing traits of the deceased person, these symbolized his or her spirit winging its way to heaven. In some cases, they were highly individualized. Theodora Ash's gravestone actually features her carved likeness, framed by an overturned hourglass and the scythe of death. The 2 Thompson children who died in the early 19th century rest beneath the winged carving of a bat, representing the long night of death. One stone bears the skull and crossbones. It's not indicative of a pirate's grave, but rather a reminder that death comes for all of us in time. Those who take the time to read the flowery but fading inscriptions on many of Colonial Park's remaining markers will find fascinating stories, like the one about Susanna Gray, departed this life by the will of God, being killed by lightning on the 26th of July, 1812. Or 15-year-old Mary Wilson, whose inscription reads, "Her Bible took fire on her breast, a few painful hours, and she slept in Jesus, to whom she devoted herself." Over the years, vandals have done great damage to the old cemetery, starting with British troops who camped out here during the American Revolution, and continuing through General Sherman's Union invaders who did the same during the Civil War.
They changed dates primarily. There are about 30 known stones that were changed.
Sometimes the vandals carved crude additions to the existing dates, as in the case of Susanna Gray, whose stone now indicates that she lived 121 years and 1,124 days. This altered stone tells us that Philip Woolhopter died in 1818 at the ripe old age of 1,491 years, and was preceded in death by his infant daughter Sarah Ann, who lived to be 10 months, 1,271 days. On the bottom of the stone, the mischievous stonecutters have carved what appears to be an image of Fort Pulaski. Thanks in no small part to the work of these vandals, coupled with periods of neglect and even misguided attempts to clean up the old cemetery, Savannians lost track of the locations of countless burials over the years. Among them are Button Gwinnett, one of Georgia's signers of the Declaration of Independence. A local politician dug up some remains that he claimed were Gwinnett's back in the 1960s and reburied them where he found them, marking the spot with an impressive granite memorial emblazoned with Gwinnett's famous signature.
Mr. Funk took the bones home and kept them under his bed in a box until this monument was built.
But no one knows for sure who lies beneath its soaring columns. Similarly, it's a mystery who is entombed beneath Colonial Park's well-recognized Coiled Snake Memorial. A descendant of Georgia Revolutionary War hero Archibald Bullock inscribed it with his name in 1921, but others countered Bullock lay elsewhere in the cemetery. Bullock's Revolutionary War brother-in-arms, General Samuel Elbert, likewise may not actually rest in his tomb at Colonial Park.
Samuel Elbert. That's another mystery out here. We hope those remains in that tomb are those of Samuel Elbert and his wife, but that's another thing that's open to question.
Early in the 20th century, young boys found old bones and coffin nails protruding from an Indian mound on Elbert's former plantation. Knowing that Elbert's family used the mound for their own burials, experts in the age before forensic science declared the bones to be Elbert's and interred them here in 1924.
There are bones in that tomb, and we say they're Samuel Elbert, but we're not really sure. They could be an Indian, they could be some other member of the Ray family. We don't really know, but we honor that as a memorial of Samuel Elbert.
But the most notable lost grave is that of Revolutionary War hero Nathaniel Greene, a trusted aide of George Washington's who lived in Savannah after the war. When he died in June 1786, Greene was laid to rest inside the tomb that once belonged to Royal Lieutenant Governor John Graham, who fled after the Revolution. Searchers opened 4 unmarked tombs in the first years of the 20th century in their search for Greene's remains. Eventually, they found a coffin marked with a silver plate bearing Greene's name. As throngs of Savannians looked on, the great general was carried out of Colonial Park and reinterred beneath a towering obelisk erected in his honor in Johnson Square. But little did they know that Greene's sworn enemy in life, a British officer named John Maitland, who helped the Redcoats win the Battle of Savannah in 1779, had been buried in the former Graham Vault before Greene, and shared the tomb with the American general for more than a century. Retired pathologist and local historian Preston Russell figured out the truth.
Well, nobody made the connection, but I happened to read Alexander Lawrence's great book called Storm Over Savannah, and I gather Lawrence was a hero, thought that John Maitland was a hero, and that was the first time I knew that John Maitland was buried in the vault, and I picked up on that. So in the early part of the 1980s, I got permission from the city and arranged to have a team of archaeologists from Armstrong College. We went into that vault, and lo and behold, we found enough remains bones to make up one adult human being.
The lower right arm and hand were missing, just like Maitland's, who lost them in combat in Spain before he came to Savannah. Russell declared the case closed and returned the remains to Maitland's descendant in Scotland, the 15th Earl of Lauderdale.
I would say that with reasonable certainty those are Maitland's remains, and this was really before the time of DNA, so nobody would be able to prove or disprove that those were Maitland's remains.
The old burying ground has been closed to new burials since 1853, when a new cemetery opened in Savannah to receive the dead. Families removed hundreds of bodies from Colonial Park and transported them elsewhere for reburial. But this quiet place still has many stories to tell to those who will listen. The cemetery the city of Savannah created to replace the old Colonial Cemetery downtown was named Laurel Grove. This city of the dead contains thousands of beautiful tombs and grave markers from the mid-19th century through modern times of every size and shape imaginable, from intricately carved statues to a handful of crude wooden headstones. Surprisingly, few Savannians or tourists ever step inside the gates to appreciate this historical treasure.
This is a gorgeous site. This is a slice of Civil War history, mid-19th century Savannah, and people aren't appreciating it and understanding it as much as they should. Some of the best mid-19th century ironwork is found enclosing these lots, and beautiful monuments in marble, granite, sandstone, and even zinc. So it's a great collection of many interesting features.
Laurel Grove is actually divided into two separate cemeteries. Laurel Grove North was the final resting place for Savannah's white citizens, and Laurel Grove South for African Americans. Laurel Grove North boasts a stunning variety of graves, from the brick low-country tombs we recognize from Colonial Park to elaborate mausoleums, multi-story gated complexes, tiny Gothic churches, and even Greek temples.
So not only do you see the princes, you see the paupers here. It is a connection, and I enjoy it because it's like visiting old friends that you don't see all the time. I like seeing the people, remembering the names, rethinking all the connections between the families out here, understanding Savannah's history by looking at it.
The first burial in Laurel Grove North was Mary Louisa Smith, who died at the tender age of 13 and was buried here in October 1852. Others were moved here from family plots in Colonial Park. This family brought stones from the old burial ground and placed them in their new plot at Laurel Grove. Countless famous and influential Savannians were buried here over the years. Probably the most visited grave in Laurel Grove belongs to Girl Scouts founder Juliette Gordon Low.
Mrs. Low was buried in her Girl Scout uniform, and this was part of her beliefs, and Girl Scouts come and pay tribute to her regularly. The most common trinkets left are daisies. They love to leave packages of daisies. Frequently they are personal notes to her that you'll find in Ziploc bags, and other tokens and things that they come. Frequently Girl Scout badges are left on the site, some of the smaller ones and such.
Florence Martis, Savannah's famous waving girl who died in 1943, shares this double headstone with her brother George. Colonel James Marshall and his wife Mary, owners of the Marshall House, Savannah's oldest hotel, are buried side by side beneath an obelisk. The striking statue of a girl kneeling in prayer honors their daughter. Wealthy Savannah cotton merchant Andrew Low, who lived in a magnificent house on Lafayette Square, rests in an interesting plot paved with brick flooring. This grave bears the remains of World War I flying ace and hometown hero, Major General Frank Hunter, the namesake of modern-day Hunter Army Airfield. And this one marks the grave of composer James Pierpont, who penned the holiday favorite Jingle Bells when he served the Unitarian Church in Savannah in 1851. Here's the final resting place of Eliza Mackey, matriarch of a Savannah family popularized in the novels of Eugenia Price. Prominent Savannah Irish leader and St. Patrick's Day Parade Grand Marshal John Kelly stares out into eternity from atop his monument, the only one in either Laurel Grove Cemetery to bear the likeness of the deceased within. There are many ties to Savannah's railroad industry at Laurel Grove North. Central of Georgia Railway founder William Washington Gordon is interred beneath this marker in the cemetery. His co-founder, Richard Cuyler, lies beneath an austere but impressive obelisk nearby. But perhaps the most interesting railroad grave belongs to conductor John C. Crayson, who was killed at work in a boiler explosion in 1892. Crayson's epitaph tells us he died at the throttle while doing his duty.
You know exactly what happened, and you feel the grief of his family and being informed.
Laurel Grove North boasts several interesting group burial plots. The Sailor's Burial Ground is the spot where many seafarers began their voyage into eternity. A Jewish section bears many headstones etched with Hebrew text. The Stranger Ground is the final resting place for hundreds who died in Savannah without the means to afford their own burial plot elsewhere.
Even today, the Strangers Field continues to receive bodies. It receives about 40 burials a year.
But the oddest section of the entire cemetery must be Babyland, where hundreds of infants have been laid to rest over the years.
Starting around 1900, there were an increasing number of infant deaths in hospitals and lots of parents who could not afford to handle them. And Babyland today picks up about 20 a year.
Perhaps more than anything else, Laurel Grove North is known for its hundreds and hundreds of burials from the American Civil War, with heroes in gray and some in blue scattered throughout the cemetery.
This is really a Confederate utopia out here. The Gettysburg Field contains over 700 burials. Besides that, we have bunches of Confederate generals here. There are 8 Confederate generals and 1 Union general.
Among the Civil War leaders buried here are Francis Bartow, a Savannah hero who fell in the first major battle of the war, and General Lafayette McLaws, a leading Confederate commander who fought at Gettysburg and other major battles. General Jeremy Gilmer, the South's chief military engineer, rests beneath the handsome Greek Revival portico. A lonely grave tucked in the rear edge of Laurel Grove North marks the final resting place of Confederate Navy Lieutenant Thomas Pilot, commanding officer of the ironclad warship Georgia. Appropriately, the family plot of Savannah shipbuilder Henry Willink, who constructed the Georgia and 3 other ironclads for the South, is enclosed by an intricately detailed iron fence. A single obelisk marks the common grave of the 2 Habersham brothers, who both fell in battle on the same day.
They both appeared at the Battle of Atlanta in the last days of that city. And one brother was killed, and the other brother got word of it on the battlefield, and he charged in with a greater vigor, and he too was killed.
This sculpted column marks the resting place of Southern secessionist Charles Augustus Lafayette Lamar, a godson of the Marquis de Lafayette, who brought the last slave ship into the U.S. illegally in 1858.
He was an opportunist, he was a loudmouth, he bragged all over the city that a man of influence can get away with anything in a town the size of Savannah, and he did.
Lamar may have gotten away with his slave ship escapade, but he did not survive the war. He was one of the South's last casualties, killed in one of the final skirmishes of the war. Other Civil War-related graves include those of Edward C. Anderson, who commanded Savannah's Confederate river defenses and then served as the city's first post-war mayor. Charles Olmsted, who was forced to surrender Fort Pulaski to Union troops in 1862. And Anna Davenport Raines, who founded the United Daughters of the Confederacy. There are a handful of Union graves within this sea of Confederate gray. The highest-ranking Union officer buried in Laurel Grove is Savannah-born John Cuyler, who remained with the U.S. Army when war broke out and rose to the rank of Brigadier General in the Union Medical Corps. Laurel Grove Cemetery South is entered by its own separate gate. It boasts many beautiful monuments, but has a much different feel from Laurel Grove North.
They started out as one place. After the Civil War, the black community more or less took over control of Laurel Grove South. They petitioned the city to have their own keepers, to set their own burial fees, and to have their own autonomy in that area. And that seemed to be just fine at that time, and so it became basically a centerpiece of the black community here in Savannah and hallowed grounds.
The pride of Laurel Grove South is its honor roll of prominent black ministers. The first on the list is the Reverend Andrew Bryan, who shares a triple vault with the Reverend Henry Cunningham and the Reverend Andrew Cox Marshall, all important early Baptist leaders in Savannah, who stood up for their faith in a time when it was illegal for slaves to even learn to read and write. The detailed inscription over Marshall's section of the vault tells us that during the course of his long ministry, Marshall baptized more than 3,700 people, married 2,000 couples, and presided over 2,400 funerals. There are leaders in other fields buried here as well. John DeVoe was the first African-American head of customs for the Port of Savannah, as well as the publisher and founder of the city's first black newspaper, the Savannah Tribune. John's sister Jane DeVoe, also buried in Laurel Grove South, is said to have operated a secret school for black children for many years in the upper story of her home on St. Julian Street. Laurel Grove South is full of reminders of the ugly truth of Savannah's past. The thousands of Africans who were torn from their homes and sold into slavery to make this booming cotton port thrive. Thousands of them are buried here, though most lie in unmarked graves. This disjointed cluster of markers was most likely moved from an earlier black burial ground in Calhoun Square. Many stones bear only one name. Others are faded by the ravages of time. More recent memorials mark the graves of slaves whose stories we do know. Thomas Millage was owned by wealthy Savannah cotton merchant Andrew Low. This slave, named Sarah, was killed when the steamer Pulaski exploded off the North Carolina coast in 1838. The Civil War also left its mark here in many interesting ways, with African Americans buried in Laurel Grove South having served in both blue and gray. A slave known as Old Tom served throughout the war with Captain Wheaton of the Confederate Army. Reverend Alexander Harris was drafted into Southern service as part of a fife and drum corps for a local Savannah unit. Samuel Gordon Morse was the first black Savannian to fight for freedom in the Union Army, though others, like Joseph Williams of the 33rd U.S. Colored Infantry, followed him into battle. Over the many decades, Laurel Grove North and South gradually fell into neglect and disrepair. But in recent years, Savannahans in local government and in private life have made a significant effort to restore these cities of the dead, with visionaries like W. Law, who now rests in Laurel Grove South, leading the fight.
These are fascinating assets. These sites should be viewed as a historic collection, like a collection would be found in a museum. But we must remember, above all things, these are holy sites. We must remember these people deserve the proper respect and slumber of the dead.
The name Bonaventure means good fortune, and fortune certainly has smiled on this beautiful Savannah cemetery. Tucked into a tree-shaded spot along the Wilmington River, Bonaventure truly is a gem.
Over the 12 years that I've been involved, I have run into many people who tell me that this is the most beautiful cemetery in the world. And I have encountered people out here on the site who have made me believe that this is a very powerful place.
Bonaventure's glory lies in its incredible sculptures and in the interplay between the statuary and the one-of-a-kind natural setting. Bonaventure represents the full flowering of the Victorian cemetery movement, ornate gravestones and statues that reflect the gilded glory of their age.
A cemetery is intended to be a beautiful place, and Bonaventure, like many of the others in that category, came along as a Victorian garden-style cemetery. And it was intended that people would use it like a park. They came for carriage rides, for picnics, for walks, as well as to tend their lots and to communicate with their lost loved ones.
Many modern-day visitors come to Bonaventure because of the cemetery's ongoing association with the best-selling book, Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. Many come in search of the iconic Bird Girl statue that graced the now-famous cover of John Barron's novel. The Bird Girl used to stand here in the Trostel family plot at the grave of Lucy Boyd Trostel, but now the statue is on exhibit at the Telfair Museum of Art in downtown Savannah. Others come to see the grave of poet Conrad Aiken and his parents. Aiken's mother and father both died in a murder-suicide when he was a child. The poet is now buried under a bench that faces their double headstone in the Wilmington River in the distance. Aiken's epitaph, Cosmos Mariner, Destination Unknown, is derived from the name of a ship he saw passing here many years ago. Still others are drawn to the Mercer family plot, final resting place of great 20th century lyricist and Savannah native Johnny Mercer and many of his loved ones. Each marker is engraved with a lyric from one of Mercer's thousands of hit popular songs, and a red rose always graces his grave. In the corner sits a bench bearing Mercer's profile and caricature. But without a doubt, the most visited and most photographed monument in Bonaventure is the one affectionately known as Little Gracie.
Gracie is perhaps the best known work of a sculptor named John Walz, W-A-L-Z, who originally came to Savannah to install the first two monuments of artists that were to go outside of our Telfair Museum. And he carved funeral monuments for people buried in all of the cemeteries that existed during his lifetime. And we believe that Bonaventure has close to 100 signed John Walz works. Gracie is the most popular of the John Walz works and maybe the most popular monument in the cemetery. Gracie was a 6-year-old child whose parents operated the Pulaski House Hotel downtown. And close to Easter in 1889, they took her out to get a new outfit, little button-top shoes, and fortunately, they had her photograph made because Gracie died very suddenly after that of pneumonia, and they had no other children. They were absolutely bereft. And at some point, they were able to take that photograph of her in her Easter outfit to the sculptor John Walls, who then created this wonderful, lifelike little girl from the photograph.
This detailed monument was carved by another gifted Savannah sculptor named Antonio Alifi, who worked for a time under John Walls before going into business for himself. There are also well-known and important Georgians buried in Bonaventure. Noble Jones, one of Georgia's original colonial leaders and the founder of the Wormslow Plantation, was moved here from Colonial Park in the mid-19th century. Telfair Academy founder Mary Telfair shares a memorial with her father Edward, Georgia's first state governor. This tall obelisk honors Richard Arnold, the mayor who surrendered Savannah to General Sherman in 1864. A bust of General Robert Anderson, the founder of Savannah's modern police force, tops his monument. And the vault of William Gaston, famous for his hospitality to strangers in life, long served as a temporary resting place for strangers who died in Savannah. Gaston's vault was moved here from Colonial Park. The Marathon Runner Memorial honors local athlete Julia Denise Backus Smith, who died in 2003. The vault of Dr. Phineas Miller Collock, which looks like a collapsed house, is mostly concealed underground. The inscription on U.S. Navy Lieutenant John Halsell First's monument tells us he died during a storm aboard the battleship USS Illinois, part of Teddy Roosevelt's Great White Fleet, in 1907. This small obelisk, bearing Arabic script, marks the grave of Sheikh Nassif Rahal, who immigrated to Savannah from Lebanon and started a grocery business. Nearby, there's a section of stones marking the graves of members of Savannah's large Greek community. But one of the largest and perhaps most unique sections in the cemetery is set aside for Savannah's Jews. Their stones are inscribed in Hebrew as well as English, and frequently bear symbols such as menorahs or open Torahs. Thousands of small stones have been placed atop these graves over the years, a Jewish tradition. One grave contains the ashes of more than 300 victims of the Holocaust, all from a single town in Germany. There's much to see in Bonaventure, and frequently those who stop by for a short visit wind up staying much longer than they intended, and even return for a second time. Some find the cemetery changes them.
Bonaventure has given me a voice I didn't know I had. I love doing the tours. I love introducing people to this site because it is something that they appreciate. It's always interesting. It's a fascinating place.
There have always been special places for Savannah's Catholics to enter eternal rest, starting with the southwest corner of Colonial Park Cemetery. But when city officials refused requests from the local bishop to create a Catholic section of Laurel Grove in the mid-19th century, the Catholic Church created its own burial ground here in eastern Savannah. The church secured 8 acres for less than $1,000 on land that used to be a British fortification from the Revolutionary War.
About 160 graves from Colonial Cemetery were moved here. And in 1853, when this opened, there was a dedication. It was only a few days after it opened that the first Catholic burial took place out here, and it was a woman who died on Cockspur Island.
In an all too familiar scenario for Savannahans, Union troops camped out amidst the Catholic graves after the city's surrender in 1864. To add insult to injury, the Yankees dug up bodies and moved graves to create earthworks for protection against rebel attacks.
And the church protested vehemently. And when the nuns, the Sisters of Mercy, found out that they were digging up the graves of the two bishops out here, they got really upset. They came out here and they removed the bodies of the two bishops, 2 priests, and 4 nuns. And they took them into Savannah and buried them in the garden of the convent, St. Vincent's Convent.
The church reburied the men and women of the cloth here on Christmas Eve 1867. Today, there are many more servants of the church resting on these rolling green acres, with members of various orders buried together in group plots. Mother Matilda Beasley rests here. She founded the first order of black nuns in Georgia. In the lot set aside for priests, 2 friends, both bishops, lay side by side.
Bishop Gartland was the first bishop in Savannah. He was living here when the 1854 yellow fever epidemic broke out. He had a friend who was the vicar general in Philadelphia, also a bishop. His name was Barron, who came down here, and the 2 of them ministered to the yellow fever victims. Unfortunately, both of them contracted yellow fever, and they died within a few days of each other, and they are buried here in the priest lot.
A few steps away, visitors may find a Confederate war veteran symbol marking the grave of Father Peter Whalen, known as the Rebel Priest. Whalen served as chaplain for the Confederate garrison at Fort Pulaski and was taken prisoner along with the rest of the troops after the fort surrendered in 1862. Yet when the church gained Whalen's freedom, he chose to remain with his soldiers and minister to their needs. Later, Whalen went to Andersonville, Georgia, and ministered to the thousands of starving Union prisoners of war confined there.
And this was the first time a minister had entered that prison camp, and he did what he could, and he was much beloved there. He came back to Savannah, and he was in ill health from his years in both prison camps. And he died in Savannah, and it was said his funeral was the largest ever held. It was held in the old cathedral, which was on the corner of Perry and Drayton Street. And they said the funeral procession was probably several miles long.
Several hundred Civil War soldiers are buried here, most members of a local unit known as the Irish Jasper Greens. Many were interred in an area of the cemetery known as Free Ground, a spot whose location is unknown to historians today. Now members of the United Daughters of the Confederacy are researching the names of the troops and have begun placing stones in individual soldiers' honor at the foot of the Jasper Green Monument. The work of Savannah's best-known Victorian sculptors is represented here, including a rare signed sculpture by Antonio Alifi, who came to Savannah as a young man from Sicily.
Antonio Alifi was an expert at carving angels. He had been carving angels since he was 9 years old. That angel is very detailed. Mr. Alifi used his daughter Grace as the model for that angel.
Alifi's mentor and boss, John Waltz's work stands out here as well, which may include the remains of a dog.
Prince grieved for his master. He had been constantly with Patrick, and it was only a few months after Patrick died that Prince died. And then some people began to say, well, you can't bury an animal in a Catholic cemetery. It's against the rules of the church. It reads Prince, he loved his master, and we like to think he's here right beside his master.
Canines notwithstanding, there are many similarities between Catholic Cemetery and Savannah's other burying grounds. You'll find brick vaults and soaring spires here as well, but there are things that make this place unique.
This is a different feeling. These were people, many of them were just ordinary people, but they all had a part in the building of Savannah. They were all prominent in their own particular environment. It's a testimony to their faith.
Savannah's Jewish community dates to the city's earliest days. The first Jewish settlers arrived just a few months after General Oglethorpe and the first colonists.
Then one of the original 41 Jewish settlers died in December of 1733, and Mr. Oglethorpe gave the congregation a plot of land.
Now a marker denotes the spot where the original burying ground was located, in the median of Oglethorpe Street near the intersection with Bull. When that graveyard filled up, the only place left for Jews to be buried was Levi Scheftel's small burying plot on the southwestern outskirts of town. But he refused to let anyone outside his family be laid to rest inside.
The first Jew who died after that, Levi wouldn't let him or her be buried in his family cemetery, which angered his half-brother Mordecai.
Local tradition has it that Levi's stubbornness prompted Mordecai, the leader of the local Jewish community, to create a new Jewish cemetery just a stone's throw away from Levi's. Historians estimate at least 84 burials, but probably many more than that, took place here between roughly 1770 and the last known burial in 1881. The quiet slumber of these dead was disturbed in October of 1779, when thousands of French and American troops fought unsuccessfully to retake Savannah from British forces. The Allies placed cannon around the Jewish burying ground and used it as a rallying point in the battle. Today, the little cemetery is the only physical structure left from that bloody day. Local Jewish historian Alan Gaynor is proud of what the graveyard represents and of the people who are buried inside its walls.
Mordecai Scheftel, for example, was first born in America of one of the two German Jewish families. He was a hero of the American Revolution, highest ranking Jewish officer in the American Revolution. Great patriot in Savannah.
An interstate highway now looms just over the cemetery's walls. Few of the thousands who drive by every day are even aware of this treasure they fly past in the blink of an eye. From the quaint symbolism and unique brick vaults of Colonial Park, to the thousands of historical connections at Laurel Grove North, and the courageous black leaders of Laurel Grove South. From the breathtaking beauty of Bonaventure, to the towering spires and rich meaning of Catholic Cemetery, and the hidden history of the little Jewish cemeteries swallowed by time. Savannah's burying grounds invite you to come for a visit. Bring an open mind and stay a while. You're among family.
This is our history. Wherever you go in the South, you walk into a cemetery, you're looking at that area's history. You look at the people, and if you think about those, you know that many of them have living descendants still around. And we sort of are attached to our dead, not as ghosts or hauntings per se, but because they are part of us. We have this continuity with the past that we hold on to and we cling to. And it gives us sort of a sense of purpose.
If you enjoyed Savannah's Historic Cemeteries, you'll also want to purchase a copy of Savannah's Historic Homes, a behind-the-scenes look inside 16 of the hostess city's most incredible mansions. Visit us online at cosmosavannah.com for more information on this and other films.